Welcome to the latest edition of our AT Kearney Procurement and Analytics Solutions Wave of the Future podcast series. I'm Helen Clegg, and my guest today is Chris Clements, a director with our Procurement and Analytics Solutions practice in Sydney, Australia. In today's podcast, Chris is going to talk about the first 100 days of a Chief Procurement Officer, what is critical about the first 100 days, and strategies for new CPOs to navigate successfully through their first 3 months in office. Chris, welcome to the series. I'd like to begin by asking you why the first 100 days are so important to new CPOs.
Thanks, Helen. It's great to be here. The CPO is a really interesting role, and quite often the CPO has been brought in to an organisation to deliver long-lasting, significant change. Quite often these people, these CPOs, Chief Procurement Officers, are the type of person that comes in, want to build something, improve it, and then move on. So once it actually turns to a business as usual type of activity, they're then looking for the next opportunity to make significant change and drive significant value in a business. So quite often what that actually means is that the CPO seat is a bit of a hot seat, with the average tenure lasting between 3 to 4 years, which is not long really when you think about it. So this is why the first 100 days is really, really important. And I guess the fact that you've got such a short time to deliver such significant value, it really needs to set the tone for the years ahead. So the plan is really about planning for success, and it's around creating a solid footing so that you can deliver the value that the business is looking for.
Chris, you just mentioned there a framework that you developed. I know it's called, for short, the F100D, or First 100 Days in Office. Why did you develop the framework, and how does it help new CPOs about to start in their new challenging role?
Yeah, that's a good question, Helen. I guess from my perspective, what I've certainly noticed is that a new CPO will join an organization and everyone is expecting a lot of change really quickly. So the reason that the framework has actually been developed is in order to give them a platform and a tool to make it easier in terms of preparing their first 100 days. So there are 8 dimensions to this tool. The first one is really around setting the agenda and the strategy for the way ahead across the next little short period of time. The second component is around understanding the culture and the way of doing things within the organization. The third dimension is around about managing expectations. As I mentioned earlier, the business will be expecting a lot of things and a lot of things very quickly. So one of the key things that the CPO needs to do going forward is around how do I manage those expectations of those key stakeholders within the business, because something they may wish to see something done immediately could take potentially 6, 9, 12, potentially even 18 months. One of the other areas around about developing the communication strategy. So how am I going to talk? How am I going to share the vision? How am I going to share information? The fifth component is about understanding the job and what's actually expected of me. Quite often what's actually shared within an interview might be a little bit different to when you're actually in the seat. You need to understand what are the performance measures and targets that are expected of you going forward, and you also need to consider your training needs. Are there areas where I'm potentially a little bit weak and need some support? Do I need some training, or do I surround myself with people that can assist me because they've got the relevant skills? And the last dimension is really about developing the stakeholder strategy. So what this framework really does is it looks at how I'm going to build my plan, and it helps me to understand how I should speak to people. It helps me understand how things are going to get done from a cultural perspective. It helps me to manage expectations. It helps me to define the measures, and it helps me to communicate with all of those that I need to going forward.
So, Chris, from your perspective, what are the 3 most challenging dimensions in this framework, and why?
Yeah, that's another interesting question, Helen. I think there are 3 very interesting ones from my perspective. And one of the first ones I want to pull out and talk about is the culture and the way of doing things. Quite often when change is done within a business, I think change is often spoke about and often underdone. And it's all of these informal cultural dimensions and informal networks that actually allow change to happen and to take place. So I think the goal and what we are really trying to achieve in this space is learning what the formal networks are and the informal networks so that you can understand how you can change and how you can make significant lasting change in an organization. It's not just about the hierarchy. It's also about who sets the pace, how are the decisions made, and who makes them. Quite often there are some people that are not in positions of power that have quite an influence on some of the outcomes and the decisions. So it's really about understanding where the real power structure is, and it's really key to understand what is this cultural dimension when you're building your plan going forward. Quite often, some organizations and some CPOs will try to do what they've done in the past. Well, if the culture is significantly different, you're going to have a challenge in terms of making that happen and how you're going to deliver that going forward. The second one I spoke of earlier was managing expectations. Quite often, as I said, the new CPO arrives and the business expects change immediately. This is quite difficult to do because you need to sort of get under the cover of what's happening in the organization. So really, in terms of thinking about managing expectations, it's about understanding what the business is looking for and how do you manage that expectation. They may be looking for something which you can't deliver immediately. So it's about capturing and monitoring that expectation and then influencing that expectation. Clearly, if something's only going to be delivered in 1 year, those particular stakeholders need to be made aware of that. Otherwise, they'll become disappointed, and that could have a negative effect on what you're trying to achieve. The third key one I'd really like to talk about is understanding what is your job and what is expected of you. What happens often is initial impressions from interviews are rarely accurate or complete. So you really need to get under the skin of that and understand what the key expectations of you are. What are your precise responsibilities from a budgetary and a management perspective? It's really around understanding those lateral lines of responsibility. So those are probably the three I talk about, which is really understanding the culture and the way things get done. How do you manage expectations and really understanding what is your job and what is expected of you going forward?
So, Chris, the new CPO has a framework, knows what the three most challenging dimensions are, and is ready to go. What should they be doing in their first month?
Well, the first month is really about walking the floors, meeting and greeting people, actually getting around the business, asking lots of questions, and finding out as much information as you possibly can. You really need to get to understand what the business needs are. You need to understand how the procurement organization is perceived. So it's really about information gathering. It's not about creating a solution. What you will probably start to do as well within that first month is you'll start to have the initial thoughts of a plan based on speaking to some of the key stakeholders and some of the executives. But it's really about walking the floor, meeting and greeting, and gathering as much information as you possibly can.
And Chris, in their second month, what should they concentrate on?
So this is where it starts to change a little bit. So now for the first 30 days, you've gone and you've met a lot of people and you've started to hear about a lot of problems. One of the key things you need to work out is where can I make an impact? And what you're probably going to find is that there are some quick wins and some areas which won't take a lot of effort, but you can actually make a real change and a real difference to a number of people. This is really where you can hit some home runs. So I think this is a great space where you can start to build up the confidence that the business has in you as an individual, and then will eventually translate to your organization. At the same time, it's around about continuing to refine the vision that you have, potentially even starting to share that with a number of key people and building momentum. So it's really about building confidence, sharing the vision, and getting some momentum going forward.
Chris, let's hypothesize and say that our new CPO has got through the first 2 months with flying colours and is coming up to the final 30 days of their first 100. What goals should they aim to accomplish during this last phase of the F100D?
In the second phase, I spoke about the fact that we were starting to assist the business to make some small changes. So really, it's about continuing to deliver on those quick wins so that you're still building your credibility. You are also refining your procurement vision in terms of the future, and you're sharing that vision of the future until the point that you actually get a final plan in place, which you will have endorsed by the executive team, and then you mobilize your team to go forward to deliver on the plan. So essentially, at the end of the 100 days, you have a plan. It's quite often for about 18 or 24 months, looking forward in terms of a number of key things you're going to do, which normally includes delivering value and about creating sustainability going forward.
And finally, Chris, what are the 3 key takeaways for new CPOs to remember as they embark on their new role?
Well, the first one I would really like to talk about is it's a great time for you to tell the business who you are and what you're all about. So it does create a bit of a platform where you get exposure to a lot of senior executives and a lot of stakeholders talking about the change and talking about what change you are going to deliver to the business over time. The second thing is the first 100 days is really a significant sort of portion of your career in that organization. Is it really sets the stage and the foundation for your time at that organization going forward. The first 100 days is really going to set the platform for what's going to be achieved in the coming years and what's going to make you a success. The third is really not to go into the new organization with any preconceived ideas about what has and hasn't worked in the past. I think you can use that as a starting point, but you really need to listen and learn and review and modify your behavior so it fits in with your new organization and their appetite for change.
Thanks, Chris. I found that incredibly interesting and very insightful. So, just to summarize, the CPO is a powerful role about building change within the procurement organization. It's about setting the tone for the years ahead. And using a practical framework such as the F100D is a helpful way of navigating successfully through the first 3 challenging months in office. On that note, I'd like to thank Chris Clements in Sydney, Australia, for being my guest today. I'd also like to thank our production engineer, Tom Klein, in San Francisco. Thank you for listening to this edition of The Wave of the Future. If you have any comments on this podcast or have a suggestion for a podcast topic, please share your thoughts via Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @ATKPAS. This has been an AT Kearney Procurement and Analytics Solutions podcast production. Join us again soon for our next Wave of the Future podcast.